when my wife came to the U.S. as a Brit, I wanted her to learn American politics. So I said, the one book you've got to read is Why Americans Hate Politics. It was one of EJ's, I think your first book. And it's still, I'm recommending it as one of the best summaries of recent American political history with a perspective that's very, very helpful. But I want to say EJ's latest book, Our Divided Political Heart, is the best thing written this fall and for a long time about politics. And
isn't he a wonderful man?
It's true. It's true.
Why am I sitting here?
And I don't say that about a lot of books, but this is a book that really understands the kind of narrative divide that we have right now. And I think the narrative that can take us forward beyond the election, no matter who wins. So EJ is literally my favorite columnist in the country, and I think one of the best commentators on American public life that we've had for a long time. He's at Brookings, he's here at Georgetown, he writes for the Post, as you know, and he's just a sane voice. When at EJ's birthday party, David Brooks was there. It was EJ's friends, including David Brooks, and to me that was very insightful. Here's David Brooks and EJ Dionne. If American political discourse was a conversation between EJ and David Brooks, we'd be in a very different country than we are today. I like to read David's columns too, but I usually agree with EJ's a lot more. It is a great pleasure. EJ, there's a debate tonight, if you haven't heard. Terribly busy day for you. That you'd come here on this day during the campaign is a great blessing to us. We're very thankful. This is a terrific class. We're having a great time. And I wanted them to meet you and you to meet them, and so here we are. So come and talk to us about faith and media and politics in light of where we are, and they'll have lots of questions for you. So come and talk to us, and then we'll sit and have questions for a while. Let's give EJ a warm welcome.
Do I need the mic for the purposes of the tape, or? Yeah.
This mic here.
Well, you can, if you want.
I can just sit here.
Great.
Yeah.
That works.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you. I think at least as much of Jim as he thinks of me. That was a very generous introduction. I always like to note that I once got an introduction that ended. I was out of town giving a talk on politics, and it ended. And now for the latest dope from Washington, here's EJ Dionne. So thank you, Jim, for that. And I have been a fan of Jim's since long before I met him, I should say. And when Jim had started Sojourners a long time ago, and the work he did, and you know, Jim understood a lot of things about religion and politics before a lot of other people did. And I always say that Democrats really discovered God in the exit polls of the 2004 election. And since you can discover God anywhere, why not the exit polls? And that's when a lot of other people, a lot of us have been paying attention to Jim for a long time, a lot of other people started paying attention to Jim, and I think that was providential for our politics. What I thought I would do are three quick things. The first is to talk just a bit about the thesis of the book that Jim kindly plugged, the new book, because I do think that the argument I talk about in the book is the argument that we've heard in the first two debates, or at least part of that argument. We hope it'll be fully joined tonight. And second, I want to talk a little about the role of religion in this campaign. And lastly, make a couple of fearless predictions about tonight, just to open up the discussion about tonight in case anybody is remotely interested in the debate many of us are going to watch this evening. So on the book, the book is called Our Divided Political Heart, and the thesis is very straightforward. The title refers to the idea that from the very beginning, we Americans have been torn by a deep but I believe healthy tension between our love of individualism and liberty and our affection for and quest for community. And I think America is neither all one thing nor all the other. And that we've gone through periods of self-correction where we felt we tilted too far in one direction or the other. And we tend to keep ourselves on the rails by acknowledging both sets of values. And the book starts actually by talking about American decline, fears of American decline, as being central to our politics for close to a decade now. I am not a declinist. I always like to quote my favorite line on us, which is Winston Churchill, who said Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities. I think our country has a real gift for self-correction. Tocqueville said that about us a very long time ago, and I think that's true. But sometimes the self-correction process takes longer than at other times. It took us a very long time to correct our original sin of slavery, but we eventually got there. I wrote the book because I was struck by a short-term political event and a longer-term line of argument about us. The short-term political event was the rise of the Tea Party. And at the beginning of the book, I thanked the Tea Party for encouraging us to look back to our past for inspiration and for understanding. Then I proceed to criticize the Tea Party's view of our history because my view is quite different than theirs. But I think at the heart of our debate right now is a debate about who we are. And we can't agree on who we are because we can't agree on who we've been. And so I argue that if you look at our founding documents, at the argument over the Constitution, at the early years of our republic, you see this balance pop up all the time. I would just ask you, what is the first word of the Constitution of the United States? The first word of the Constitution of the United States is the word we. We, the people of the United States, and the preamble describes a series of goals for government, including providing for the general welfare. I always like to point out that welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. And it's a series of common goals. The first word isn't I. And the preamble talks about ensuring liberty for ourselves and our posterity, not myself and my posterity, ourselves and our posterity. Or if you take a look at the Declaration, at the beginning, we all remember that we have from our Creator, we've been endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A strong declaration on behalf of liberty. The very last part of the Declaration of Independence is where our founders pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to achieving the goals of the Declaration. This was, our founders realized that these great things had to be achieved together. We couldn't achieve them simply as individuals. I also like to point out that if you remember all that great list of complaints Jefferson has in the Declaration, he doesn't get to taxes till number 17. And then even then he doesn't argue that we shouldn't have any taxes. He just talks about our lack of say and how we were taxed. The first several complaints are about the king not allowing us to govern ourselves. These were not anti-government zealots, our founders. Similarly, I argue that the Constitution was conceived in balance and that the Constitution contains competing values. The Constitution also involved a whole series of compromises, including on the great and fundamental issue of slavery. And that if you wonder what sense are we to make of originalism as a way of reading the Constitution, I point out in the book that within 3 years of its adoption, its two leading authors and interpreters, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, disagreed on whether establishing a Bank of the United States was constitutional. So I would just ask if the original guys who wrote the original document and wrote the original interpretation of it in the Federalist don't agree on its original meaning, what are we to make of the idea of originalism? And I go on from there to talk about government. I try to be careful to say that government is not the same as community, but I do think that government is often called upon to, in a democratic society, in a free republic, to represent the interests of community, to express what we as a community think should be the law of the land and the values of the country. And I argue that if you believe that government had little role in building us up as a country, you have to read Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, and Abraham Lincoln, among others, out of the first 100 years of American history. I'm happy to talk about that some more. Now, what does all this have to do with now? Well, I believe that our friends in the Tea Party are looking back to what is an unusual period, an exceptional period, if you will, in our history, the period of the Gilded Age, roughly from the end of the Civil War to the rise of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, where we were indeed a country much taken by the idea of radical individualism. It was the period when social Darwinism was in vogue, and the idea that the survival of the fittest could actually serve us well as a social philosophy. We went through the Gilded Age. There was a lot of economic creativity in that period, it should be said. But the country wasn't happy with it. And out of that period came both the populist and progressive movements, which I argue in the book, when they came together in the first decade of the 20th century, overthrew this period of radical individualism. Now, many argue that the progressives and the populists and later the New Dealers and the Great Society folks were really breaking with our past and creating a period of big government. But if you read our national story, as I do, which I believe, obviously I wrote the book, so I think it's the right way to read our national story, then you see the progressives and the populists and the New Dealers not as simply innovators, although they were innovative, but as actually restorationists. They restored the great American balance between government and the market, between individualism and community. And we've really been governed under a kind of long consensus that they established. And I think that we face a very difficult political argument now, because for the first time, our friends in the conservative movement have been building toward this, but they have never, to the degree they have in the last 5 years, adopted radical individualism as central to their view. Indeed, in the book, I speak rather fondly of those forms of conservatism that emphasize community. And I even have some good things to say about compassionate conservatism. I don't know if Mike Gerson is going to come in to talk to the class, but Mike Gerson, who worked for President Bush, I told Mike once I didn't realize how much I like compassionate conservatives until you guys almost completely disappeared. And I think that what you're seeing now is an effort to sort of push any idea of compassionate conservatism off to the side and push away the communitarian tendencies within conservatism. I like to remind people that William F. Buckley Jr., who, as many of you know, was in many ways the founder of modern conservatism, wrote toward the end of his life a very important book, I thought, called Gratitude, where he argued that those of us who grew up in this country with its protection, with its nurturing, owed something back to the country, a kind of communitarian conservative idea. I do think that if Bill Buckley, the founder of modern conservatism, tried to run in a Republican primary right now on the basis of the book Gratitude, he'd lose the primary. And I like to think this is a temporary change in conservatism. And I think that this election is very much about whether whether we continue to embrace the traditional American balance or whether we embark on another experiment with a kind of radical individualism. So I think the stakes are high in the debate tonight. I think you saw this particularly in the Biden Ryan debate. I think these themes were very clear. The president, for whatever reason, chose not to make these themes quite as clear in the first debate. I think we will probably see those themes come out more clearly this evening. The second thing I want to say very briefly is to talk about religion and politics. I think it's been striking, and Jim and I haven't talked about this, so I don't even know whether he agrees with me on this or not. But it is striking that religious themes, explicit and implicit, have played far less of a role in this election than they have they had in 2008 or in 2004. Now, some of that is not surprising, that we have had a big economic downturn and economic issues loom very large for almost everybody, regardless of their views on social or religious issues. And this has happened before. The 1928 election between Al Smith and Herbert Hoover was very much a cultural and religious war about whether we should continue the prohibition of alcohol and whether we should elect Al Smith as the first Catholic president of the United States. We voted for Hoover, thereby continuing with prohibition for another 4 years and rejecting the first Catholic president. But a funny thing happened on the road to 1932, and it's the Great Crash and followed by the Great Depression. And suddenly all of these cultural and religious issues receded. And one of the favorite things I've ever run across was a letter from a Missouri Democrat to Jim Farley, who was FDR's main political guy. And he was writing about prohibition and the fight at the time, the people who were for prohibition were called the Dries and the anti-prohibitionists were called the Wets. And And this gentleman wrote, Jim Farley, I don't know why the wets and the dries are arguing about alcohol when neither of them can afford the price of a drink. And so the Depression rolled back this kind of cultural politics. So that's happened to some degree, but not nearly to the degree that it happened after the Great Crash. You still have an organized religious conservative movement, which played a major role in the Republican primaries. I think it's worth noting that Mitt Romney did not win a primary where white evangelicals cast a majority of the votes until after he had secured his party's nomination. And I've always wanted to go back and check to make sure that was true up to a certain point in the primary. But in the very early primaries, it was very clear. Romney did quite well in states where evangelicals cast a minority of Republican ballots. He did much less well in states where they were in the majority. But you have not seen religious themes play out. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is on Mitt Romney's side, he is the first Mormon nominee. And by the way, whether even if you are the most ardent Democrat, it is remarkable and a sign of the triumph of American pluralism that this is the first time a ticket does not include a Protestant on it. I mean, I don't think of Mormons as Protestants. We can argue about that. They did come out of the Protestant tradition, but you have a ticket of a Mormon and a Catholic, and the only Protestant on it, I should have said white Protestant, because the only Protestant on either ticket is our first African-American president. That's really quite remarkable. And the debate this week was the first debate ever between two Catholics running for either president or vice president. So that whatever else you make of this election, it does confirm a kind of American openness and a kind of American pluralism that I think should, in some sense, be heartening for members of other religious minorities over the long haul of our history. But because of his Mormonism, Mitt Romney has been very reluctant to talk about religious issues in an explicit way. I think that's hobbled him early on. And I think you saw that at the Republican convention. But you probably didn't watch as much of it as I did. I was paid to watch a lot of it. You weren't. But I thought of either convention. But I thought one of the most powerful moments at that convention were the two friends, people that Romney helped when he was a bishop of his church. You know, when in one case when their child was ill, and another case where he helped the family. And it painted a portrait of Mitt Romney that was one of the most attractive portraits of this man that you saw in the entire campaign. So I think he's paid a price for not wanting to talk about this very much. On the other hand, polling suggests that there might have been a cost to his religious, to him from his religious faith. I think it very much hurt him in the Iowa caucuses in 2008, where he was beaten soundly by Mike Huckabee. And on the Obama side, I think you've seen a couple of things happen. I think President Obama at Jim Wallis's call to renewal meeting in 2006 gave what I think is, and I have a lot of conservative friends who agree with this, so it's not a partisan statement, one of the single best statements about religion and American politics by a politician that we have heard in a very, very long time. It was very sophisticated. It was subtle. It tried to sort of attack prejudice against both religious people and against people who do not have religious faith. It was a remarkable document. If you haven't read it yet, I urge you all to take a look at it. So this was important to Obama, and I think after the 2004 elections, Democrats realizing that they had been hurt by John Kerry's difficulties in talking about religion, and just parenthetically, Kerry himself came to think this. I had a fascinating experience with Kerry where I learned that after the election, he spent months kind of at a monthly seminar with religious friends, people who taught at seminaries, just talking about religion, because it was actually something that mattered to him. I've been involved over the years with a group called the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, and we just invited Kerry about a year after the election to talk about his religious faith. And that you could look at it online. It was a remarkable statement, and it was an extremely well thought through statement. And my first question, which I think I asked more politely than this, went something like, why couldn't you have said that about 3 or 4 months before the 2004 election? Because it was a really remarkable statement. But what Kerry learned was reflected in the party as a whole. And there was a lot of organizing done around religious issues by Democrats, liberals, progressives, and around religious constituencies. Then a couple of things happened. One is I've always thought that when it comes to religion, Barack Obama's hero might well be Job. Because no matter how he brought this issue up, it came back to slap him in the face. First, of course, it was said that Barack Obama was actually a secret Muslim. Now, as Colin Powell reminded us before the 2008 election, there's absolutely would be nothing wrong if he were a Muslim, but he happens not to be a Muslim. He happens to be a Christian. Then, with the Jeremiah Wright controversy, it turned out that in the eyes of his critics, well, he may be a Christian, but he's a wrong kind of Christian. You can't be a Jeremiah Wright Christian. And, of course, there was the attack on Jeremiah Wright. And so I think the president developed a certain reticence, to put it diplomatically, perhaps, about talking about religion. And I think the party as a whole and progressives as a whole, with some notable exceptions like the gentleman sitting to my right and your left, really sort of figured out we did the job in 2008. We don't have to do much work in this area anymore. And I think Democrats, to a very large degree, have let some of this work go. There are people now trying at this late hour to sort of reorganize some of the groups, or organize new groups. And there are a few, again, there are other exceptions to that rule. The group Faith and Public Life has continued to do interesting work in this area on the progressive side. Nonetheless, I think there's been a pulling back. Nonetheless, I think you will, on election night, when you look at the exit polls, see some very clear religious alignments. Once again, white evangelicals will vote overwhelmingly for Mitt Romney. African Americans of all stripes will vote even more overwhelmingly for Barack Obama. Catholics, I always like to say, I'm Catholic of us, that there is no Catholic vote, and it's important, which is to say that Catholics are a classic swing group, or a kind of a 40-40-20 group. It's very hard for Republicans to get less than 40% of the Catholic vote. It's very almost impossible for Democrats to get less than 40%, but there are about 20 of us who swing around, and I think that has to do with the class position of Catholics, with some Catholics being torn on the social justice and right to life issues. There are a lot of different reasons why Catholics are a swing group, but they are. My sense is Obama will carry the Catholic vote unless he gets absolutely clobbered in the election, because Latinos will constitute some very significant share of the Catholic vote, and President Obama looks to be carrying Latinos by margins better than 2-to-1, could end up approaching 3-to-1. And so we will have religious alignments, and I think, again, that President Obama will carry the Jewish vote by a very substantial margin. There may be some chipping away from his 78% from the last time. It's very hard to get 78% of most groups. But I think the test will be how much, if it goes down 3 or 4 points as opposed to 5, 6, 7 points. But I don't see a collapse of his share of the Jewish vote. So religion will be there. Last point I want to make is about the debates. There are only 2 predictions I want to make. On whatever happens in the debate, the Republicans will declare that Barack Obama overcorrected from his failure to be aggressive in the first debate and was way too aggressive, and Mitt Romney therefore looked very presidential. I won't bet you $10,000 that'll happen, but I'm pretty sure it'll happen. And on the Democratic side, no matter what happens, Democrats will say Obama's back. He looks engaged. He's made up for the problem in the last debate. I find it very hard to believe he will reproduce the performance of the last debate. Whatever else you say about President Obama, and we can talk about that debate performance if you wish, he very rarely makes the same mistake twice. And he has proven himself reasonably good at self-correction. I have sometimes thought, I don't know if Jim agrees with this, that Barack Obama is a little like that kid that sometimes annoys you in college, where he can do no studying until the very last day and get an A in the exam. And I think Obama's had that experience at certain points in his life. I think he may have tried to do that in the first debate, and it didn't work out so well. But I think he knows that now. And so I think it's going to be a very exciting evening, and that the format is going to complicate the tasks of each candidate, which also makes it all the more interesting. But again, it's great to be with you, and always great to be with my friend Jim. So thank you.
I'm me just ask EJ one question and throw it open to you. So get your questions ready. We haven't talked yet about the role of religion in the campaign, though I have been asked by journalists, why didn't you all this year have a forum like you had before for candidates on religion and poverty? And it was clear that neither side wanted to have a forum on religion and anything for the reasons that EJ describes. This morning at the club, we had a media conference with young evangelicals, and we just released a new study today, which you haven't seen yet. And it was interesting because we had, progressive evangelicals, but also the new director of the Manhattan Declaration, a young person from FRC. And what was true is that the issues for all of these young evangelicals are no longer in the categories of a few social issues and the other issues. They all agreed that poverty was a religious issue. They talked, these are evangelicals, four of them must have mentioned the consistent ethic of life over and over again. And even the Manhattan Declaration and FRC leaders talked about there's more than abortion involved here as a faith issue. So it's a whole different conversation among younger evangelicals. So what's interesting looking forward, there was a big difference in the younger evangelical vote last time and the older evangelical vote. In 2010, it kind of went back. Well, younger ones didn't vote in 2010, a lot of them. So we'll see this time whether there's a younger evangelical, older evangelical shift. The Muslim vote has changed over the years, changing over the vote. There are more Muslims than Lutherans now in America. So how do you see that? And this evangelical shift, the old in the primaries, Republican primaries, they all said, see, the evangelicals are voting. That was true. The evangelicals who are voting in Republican primaries were voting. But last time, as you know, in Indiana and North Carolina and other places, you had evangelicals shifting votes. So the shift will still have more evangelicals voting for Romney than any other candidate. But watching the young evangelical vote will be interesting, and the Muslim vote really is changing as well.
In terms of the Muslim vote, American Muslims had not strongly committed to one party or the other before the 2004 election. In 2000, the Muslim vote, first of all, it's very hard to poll the Muslim vote because it's either scattered or concentrated in a few places, New Jersey, Michigan, particularly the suburbs of Detroit. But to the extent that you can sort of pick out Muslim precincts, it appeared that Muslims voted overwhelmingly for George W. Bush in 2000. I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is it's a fascinating case of religious signaling. If you go back and look at one of the debates, George W. made reference to the use of secret evidence against against Americans. He didn't even say Muslims. This was, for American Muslims, a code word for certain sort of forms of legal action against them that they thought were both unfair and unconstitutional. Secondly, I do think there was a reaction against the fact that Joe Lieberman was the first Jewish candidate on a national ticket. And whether some of it was overt anti-Semitism versus an attitude toward the Middle East, I think that also hurt the that there were Muslims who voted the other way because they voted against Joe Lieberman. That's just a fact. I think of the matter. Of course, then came 9/11, came the war in Iraq, and the Muslim vote shifted en masse to John Kerry in 2004. It was an extraordinary shift. Incidentally, I should say that just to go back to 2000, the one characteristic of the Bush campaign apparatus that is different from the more recent Republican campaign approaches is that Bush and Karl Rove were very interested in picking off pieces of the minority community. So to their credit, they made a concerted effort to get a share of the Muslim vote, and to their credit, they made a concerted effort to win a substantial share, which they did, of the Latino vote, and they made a substantial effort to win a share of the Jewish vote. So they were very aware that over time the Republican Party couldn't survive as primarily a party of white Protestants and about half the white Catholics. And I think that's a long-term challenge for the Republican Party. The Muslim vote also went overwhelmingly for Barack Obama, who very pointedly did not go out of his way to seek the Muslim vote. I mean, that's explained by the fact that his middle name was Hussein, and he already, with all of these, quotes, charges against him of being, a secret Muslim, they decided it wasn't particularly convenient for them to appeal directly to the Muslim vote. My hunch is that this time around, the likelihood is that the Muslim vote will stick mainly with Obama, partly because of the nature of the attacks on Obama, partly because parts of the Republican Party have been so closely associated with these laws passed in states where Sharia law would never be imposed. Therefore, the legislatures passed laws saying we may never impose Sharia law here. It's a really remarkable thing that's happened in state after state. So I suspect that Muslims will stick with Obama in substantial numbers. The last point on younger evangelicals, as you have reported yourself, Jim, younger evangelicals starting at least in 2008 have shown some significant differences with their elders, not on the abortion issue. This is what's fascinating. I think that, and my colleague Robbie Jones and I, there was a joint Brookings Public Religion Research Institute project where we've been doing a lot of polling together. We have a study coming out in a week, which you might, and your class might find interesting. I may have to cut out just a little early to check the proofs of this out in the hallway here. What we found is we did a study on younger evangelicals which showed that on abortion, their views very closely match the views of their parents. They are, broadly speaking, pro-life. Whereas on issues related to gays and lesbians, younger evangelicals are quite different. I think we still had a plurality against gay marriage, but it was much smaller, and there was much more openness to some kind of legal recognition of gay and lesbian relationships. And obviously, in terms of priorities, their priorities include a heavier emphasis on poverty, and particularly poverty in the third world, but also poverty in the United States. Anna Greenberg, a very good Democratic pollster who's done a lot of work on religion over the years, found that older white evangelicals were voting about 15% McCain. Younger white evangelicals voted 15% for Obama. That was among older white evangelicals. Younger ones voted about 30% for Obama. And so I still think that white evangelicals as a group are, to use an old Marxist term, almost overdetermined as Republican because they happen to be disproportionately members of a whole series of groups that lean Republican. So that a lot of white evangelicals are Southern, they're more Southern than the population as a whole. White Southerners are more Republican than other kinds of whites. They tend to be middle class. They tend to be married. If you put all these characteristics together, suburban in many cases, it's a Republican group. So I think the question will be, to the extent we can figure it out, what will the erosion of Obama's share be among younger white evangelicals? They'll still vote majority Republican, but will they give Obama a significant share or not? And if you think about this in the long run, just as politics would be revolutionized if Republicans could figure out how to get even 25 or 30% of the African American vote. So I think politics could be revolutionized if Democrats could figure out how to get 25 or 30% of the white evangelical vote on closer to 30% on a consistent basis.
And this is a conversation I don't want to get into today too much, but the biggest way that could happen, this morning was the same thing. On abortion, it's very consistent, but now it's applied to even climate change, killing so many people and so on. But if the Democrats didn't have what I consider a pretty extreme view on abortion, if they campaigned on safe, legal, and rare, and if they governed on what the Obama platform said last time, more of a centrist stance, I think you'd see a tremendous shift starting. But that's not going to happen. And so the survey that we did this morning had a 90%, these young evangelicals were more and more mixed except in abortion, and 10% skewed Democrat on that, 90% the Republican, even the progressive one. So the abortion issue, which is a huge issue on the evangelical side?
I am, just personally, I'm very pessimistic that we will ever have candidates taking genuinely moderate positions on abortion, because there's no percentage in it. And that the people who vote on the abortion issue, whose votes might be moved by the abortion issue, are, not surprisingly, people who have very strong views, either in favor of abortion rights or against abortion. And I've argued for a while now that one of the reasons I dislike the way the abortion issue is dealt with in politics is I think there is no issue on which politicians are forced to lie more. Because it is impossible for anyone to express any ambivalence on the question, even though a great many Americans feel great ambivalence. That is to say, many in their gut really don't like abortion, believe it raises moral problems. Some believe that it, some believe it is very close or equal to taking of a human life. At the same time, many of those same people also worry about what the costs of criminalizing abortion are. Worry that if you make abortion illegal, we would still have a great many abortions. And that kind of ambivalence that I think an awful lot of people of goodwill in the country feel just can't get expressed in politics without a candidate taking it a hard shot to the head from one side or the other, and from within many of our religious traditions. And yet I think that, and in fairness, ambivalence is not a position. Ultimately you have to say yes or no on the question of should it be legal. But I think nonetheless the moral sense of a lot of people is that this is an agonizing issue involving two very difficult choices, one way or the other. But anyway, that's so I just don't see. I like other nations which have kept abortion out of party politics. If you look at Britain and Australia, notably, whenever there are votes on abortion, they're free votes for the party. The party doesn't impose party discipline on abortion votes. And so you have actually more diversity of view as between the Tories and the Liberal Dems. The Lib Dems are pretty strongly pro-choice, but Tories and Labour, or Labour and the Conservative coalition in Australia. And I think that would actually be progress, because I think people could express their views. But again, I don't see how that ever happens. And you're going to see it in this election. I think if President Obama wins, the role of the abortion issue the abortion issue will play an important role in building up his margin among women. It won't be the only issue, and I think it's a mistake to view the women's vote as simply a vote on abortion. But I think that, so I just don't see how you get a more middle-of-the-road, moderate kind of discussion on abortion. But that's, I would love to be persuaded I'm wrong about that.
Well, I think the country would love that, but the politics of both sides won't.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take advantage of EJ being here. Questions? And you see name tags around. Ann?
I'm sorry. I was going to say I'm sorry for the O's.
So I was talking to my Republican friend, and he was sort of voicing his complaint that it's very difficult to be a conservative on Georgetown's campus, and that he often feels vilified for his beliefs, and that it's sort of undemocratic, just not really an open discussion. And we started talking about the debate, and he said it's just frustrating because he feels like a lot of the conversation post-debates isn't really about the issues. No one says, like, he had great ideas or he had great ideas. It's, oh, Obama was unprepared, or, like, Romney happened to appear very well, and no one's really talking about the issues after the debate. And I'm just wondering if you think there's any truth to that, or what your opinion on that stance would be.
I think at this moment, it is harder to be a conservative on a college campus than it was 20 years ago, simply because if you look at the polling on your generation, the people under 30 are significantly more liberal than any other. You are more liberal as taken as a group if you go up to about age 35 than any other generation. I think actually there's an interesting indicator in the polls, and I'll be very curious to see that the 18 to 21s may actually be somewhat more conservative than the 21 plus, 21 to 35. But I must say in my classes, I teach a class on religion and politics here, and I introduced the class by saying I never like to see students intimidated in a classroom, and that there are always majorities and minorities in a room, and that if I ever find the discussion is veering so far to one side that I feel that the minority will be intimidated, I'll take their side in the discussion, whether it's their view or not. And in this era, that's more likely that I am required to take the conservative side. I would note that when my wife was a student at Georgetown in 1984, the Reagan-Mondale election, she tells the story of a political science class where there were 100 kids, and hers was one of only 3 hands that went up for Walter Mondale. So it's not always been thus. I mean, that generation of Georgetown students was much more conservative. So I have some empathy for your friend. Heck, I live in a very liberal neighborhood in Montgomery County, and I kind of cheer the people who put up Republican signs because I think it takes guts in our neighborhood for somebody to put up a Romney sign. Although my wife, who's, as you can tell, a Democrat, was nervous. She thought she saw a few more Romney signs this time than she did the last time. So I have some empathy for that, for his view. Although I find students aren't, I find there's quite a lot of tolerance among students for dissenting views. You are clearly his friend, and he could tell you that. And I must say, my son's in college, and he's a liberal, and several of his very closest friends are Republican, and they battle and also have fun at the same time. Just on the issues, I think there's truth to that, except that doesn't bother me so much. Well, most people who followed the campaign knew about the issue differences between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, and indeed one of the main critiques of Obama is he didn't bring those to the fore enough for his own good. But I'm not surprised that after, yes, there is too much discussion of performance after a debate, and I also think that the spin actually affects people's view of the debate too much afterward. If you think of a football game, the spin can't turn a 24-14 defeat into a 38-3 rout in football, but it can in a debate. And if you just look at what happened to Obama in 2 days, the spin was so negative that what might have been a 1.5 touchdown defeat became this wipeout 2 or 3 days later, partly because his own side was so mad at him. I don't think you're going to see that repeat itself tonight. If you looked at Twitter during the debate, the progressive side went silent at a certain point, or went almost silent. So, but I think, unfortunately, but not shockingly, there's a lot of talk about performance after a debate. And again, I think, we actually didn't quite talk like that after the Biden-Ryan debate, because I thought the issues were drawn more clearly, even though everybody did talk about performance and Joe Biden's, laughter and all of that. But in that case, I decided that it was a good sign for Biden, because in the first debate, Democrats condemned the moderator. In the second debate, Republicans condemned the moderator and focused on Biden's affect rather than what he said. That told me a lot of them thought that Biden won the debate, just as the reverse said a lot of liberals thought that Romney had won the debate. But tell your friend that this staunch liberal is happy to comfort him anytime he feels oppressed, because I don't think students should feel intimidated about politics.
This was yesterday. You called Mitt Romney a political product. So
I kind of let loose in that column a little bit.
So
your friend won't like that column at all.
You were certainly strong in condemning him. You said Mitt Romney doesn't really believe in anything, or he's willing to repackage himself no matter what the circumstances. Why is he not being punished for that? I mean, that to me seems like a cardinal sin of politics in this country, where we expect people to believe in something and stand for something. The president has to basically believe in his record. He has no choice. Why is Romney not being punished, and why aren't people recognizing the imbalance basically of what Obama has to hold at one time, while Romney can just continue to, mechanically change himself?
Well, I was thinking about that column. Nothing I wrote in that column was all that different than anything that Rick Santorum, Rick Perry, or Newt Gingrich said during the primaries. And that I think that it's been said a lot, and particularly on abortion, where it struck me 2 years ago that if you just went online and looked at what Romney said about abortion when he ran for governor of Massachusetts and what he said now, what was really striking is the degree of deep sincerity he conveyed in both cases about how passionately he felt on both sides of that issue. And I always thought that was quite devastating. I was actually surprised that that footage wasn't used more by his right-to-life opponents in the Republican primaries. But I think that, in terms of his being punished for it, the Obama campaign there was a debate inside the Obama campaign about, do you run against Romney primarily as a flip-flopper, or do you run against him primarily as somebody who actually deep down believes all of these, what I would call right-wing, what others would call very conservative positions. And they decided that the going after him for these views was more powerful than going after him as a flip-flopper. Secondly, I think he made what turns out to be an intelligent strategic decision, which is not to shake the Etch-a-Sketch until the first debate. Because he had put Ryan on the ticket, he reassured conservatives. On the eve of the first debate, conservatives were really alarmed that he was going to get so clobbered that this might have an effect all the way down the ticket. And conservatives were just so happy that he showed so much fight against Obama that they were ready to let that go. Let go his move to the center, and I think that may turn out to be a shrewd judgment on his part. However, the question is, there's still 3 weeks to go in the election. Obama, in that debate, was criticized precisely because he never really called him on those shifts. And, it will also raises the question, what does Romney really believe? And I think that's where the 47% tape really comes back to haunt him, because whether it's true or not, and we can debate whether it's true or not, what somebody says in private on a tape is presumed to be closer to his actual views than what he says in public. That may or may not be exactly true, but it's a suspicion we have. So I think the combination of flip-flop and actually he's really that 47% guy is going to be a central theme, I suspect, of tonight's debate, and I suspect of the campaign going forward. But I think it was very effective for him in the debate, and I think the timing was very smart.
You mentioned in the Republican convention that the personal stories about Romney were some of the most attractive portraits that you'd heard about him. Do you think if he had been more open about discussing and sharing that side of him early on in the campaign, that would have actually been beneficial for him as far as attracting possible voters?
Yes. I mean, I think absolutely. My friend David Brooks, after the convention, said he thought it was political malpractice that those people hadn't been called upon earlier to give some testimony on Romney's behalf, that you didn't see any of that in any television commercials. And I think that, if Romney wins, then it'll all work and everything will look like genius. But if Romney should lose, I think one of the central reasons for his defeat would be that he spent very little time early on defining himself or telling us why we should like him. In those Republican primaries, he was so embattled that most of his advertising was anti-Santorum, anti-Gingrich, well, he didn't have to really go hard on Perry in the end. And that he spent very little time building up his own biography. He spent very little time taking his business career and putting it in the context he wanted. In the meantime, this summer, the Obama campaign put it in the context the Obama campaign wanted it to be in, which I think is one of the reasons why Romney has had so much trouble closing the gap in Ohio. There are a lot of reasons why Ohio has been the holdout swing state, but I think that's one of them. So I think it was a big mistake. I think we are so fixated on the power of negative advertising, and it is powerful, that we forget that reminding people why you're a decent person is also part of a campaign, and that most successful campaigns I have seen over the years have at least some element where the candidate tries to say, here are the things you probably like about me. And so I think, again, if he wins, then we'll all say they were geniuses. But if he doesn't win, I think that's going to be a big part of it.
As you know, EJ, one of the things that bothers me so much is the way the religious issues are defined, usually so narrowly. It's about abortion, for example. Now, your book, in the balance between individuality and community, there are deep religious issues involved in those two in that conversation. So how is this election playing out in terms of that theme in your book? And I guess some people think that Romney went to the right in the primaries, and he revealed his true moderate self in the election, and he's going to govern in a more balanced, moderate way. Others think that's a terrible, he's fooling people, and he will govern in a way that, as you said, experiments with a new Gilded Age. I mean, in terms of our topics of faith, religion, values, your book theme is central: individuality, community, the balance, and you think this election is critical for going one way or the other on that balance. So how do you see it in terms of that theme? And is Romney going to be a balanced guy, or is he really going to govern, you think, to the right?
I mean, given the title of this class, I can say it. Only God knows. But I'm inclined to think he is a more right-of-center person than not, although you have the healthcare law as the best evidence to the contrary. And you know, that shows him as more of a technocrat with some compassion. But I think that his underlying views, there was a very good piece, a very neutral piece actually, it wasn't a hit piece at all, in New York Magazine, I want to say about 6 or 8 months ago, that's worth looking up. It's about his career at Bain Capital. And the piece argues that probably Romney's core belief is in a version of capitalism as defined by Bain, that a particular kind of hyper-competitive capitalism, and he really believes in that. And I think, you know, when you think about it, one of the differences between Mitt Romney and his dad was much more of a traditional progressive Republican, but he grew up in a very different business community than Mitt Romney did. The business community of George Romney's time was still shaped by the New Deal to some degree, was still the gap between CEO and average worker pay was much smaller. It was a more constrained kind of competitive capitalism than the one Romney grew up in. And if I had to put a bet down, again, I'm not going to bet $10,000, you know, I would say that is maybe the single most important thing about him. But again, the healthcare law, back in the day, he would argue this was a market solution to a real problem. But now he's talking about emergency room care, which is the very thing he used to talk against. So, but one of the things I talk about in the book as what has been a mystery to me is how is it that conservative evangelicals can be quite so individualistic, since it's hard to see Christianity as a purely individualistic faith. Now, there are two things about this. The argument conservatives have had with my book and with me about my book is we conservatives, they will argue, care passionately about community, but what we locate that community far from government, and we are looking to, you know, Burke's little platoons, the faith-based organizations, voluntary groups to do the work of charity. And in fairness to many of these conservatives, they do a lot of that stuff themselves. They are active in their churches. I thought it was significant that Paul Ryan's blown photo op, if you followed this story, was at a St. Vincent de Paul Center where he showed up to help in a soup kitchen. It turned out they were late, so they re-cleaned plates that had already been cleaned, and it looked like he wanted the photo op, not more than anything else. But put that aside, at least, you know, St. Vincent de Paul's a great group. He showed up, and it was a way of saying we have compassion, we just express it differently. You know, what I argue back is you can't draw as clean a line between government and community as you do. I agree with conservatives that we do not want government to act in ways that undercut all the good forms of community that we appreciate. On the other hand, the people who run those soup kitchens and who run the homeless shelters are the very people who warn us that if you have the deep cuts that the Ryan budget would put through, you do a lot of damage to poor people and to their own work, because they can't handle all of the burden that would throw on them. But one of the things that I talked about briefly in the new book that I've been pondering is how can you be conservative, a Christian conservative, and that individualistic? And I decided that some of it depends on when you listen to people talk about the nature of their relationship with Jesus and who Jesus is to them. And in many cases, my evangelical friends, and you heard President Bush talk about this actually, their devotion to Jesus comes from the fact that Jesus changed my life, they will say. More progressive Christians tend to talk about how Jesus changed the world. And that a certain view of salvation, an emphasis on John 3:16, as opposed to an emphasis on the Sermon on the Mount, can lead to different paths. Now, there are many Christians who would say both. Jesus changed my life and Jesus changed the world. But I do think there is something interesting in the religious, sort of people's religious self-understandings and their understanding of what Jesus' role is in their life and in the world that may have something to do with how we sort ourselves. The last quick point I want to make is probably what bothers me most, right, or one of the things that bothers me most right now, and I see it in myself, so I'm not condemning anyone else. I'm condemning everyone, including myself, in this, is that we are in such a moment of party and ideological spirit that I think party and ideology is trumping religious faith, and that religious faith is often invoked to rationalize a party view rather than to inform it. There's a great C.S. Lewis line that we consult the scripture not to find out how we should think about politics, but how to find support for our own political party. And I think there's a lot of that going on. I try to fight that in myself. I think all of us should try to fight it, but where none of us is fighting it enough. And I just think that's something, I hope after this election we can have a conversation with each other, because I do like the Catholic parishes I joined partly because I just like the parishes. I happen to belong to two, an old one before I moved, which I didn't want to quit, and a new one which is closer to where I live. And the two pastors said I could be a dual citizen, as one of them put it. But I like them because they're politically diverse. And there are so many religious institutions now that don't have political diversity anymore. And so we can acknowledge that somebody who disagrees with us on politics might be struggling with, to live, in this case, a good Christian life. It would apply across denominations, as opposed to assuming that if you don't vote the way I do, you are going to be condemned eternally to hell. That seems an odd way to approach faith or politics to me. And I think in this really hard party period, and as you can tell from that column, I can be fairly partisan at this moment. I still would like us to struggle with ourselves on this more than I think we all do.
Jonah.
You talked a lot about. Thank you. You talked a lot about how I guess the Tea Party has kind of co-opted the Republican Party, or the Republican Party's co-opted the Tea Party and moved towards this Gilded Age, individualistic, kind of rugged individual sort of ethos. Do you see the Democratic Party, though, as also, especially under Obama, abandoning the new Democratic pledge that Clinton and a lot of the Democrats offered, like with Keystone XL, contraceptive coverage, abandoning Bull Simpson? Do you see that as also kind of adding to the polarization and not aiding the political climate?
Actually, no. And let me elaborate. I think that the polarization is asymmetric. And this is something my friends Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein argued in their book. And I think the polling confirms it. I think the votes in Congress confirm it, that if you look at just who considers themselves a Republican now or who considers themselves a conservative now, those groups are well to the right of their views than they used to be. If you look at how many Republicans break with their majority versus how many Democrats break with their majority in the House, for example, you're hard-pressed to find usually more than 1, 2, or 3 Republicans who'll break, whereas you usually see, even with the sort of shellacking of the blue dog Democrats in 2010, you still see 19, 20, 21, 25 Democrats break, and you've seen that in the Senate as well. I do think there is more obvious polarization of the sort you talk about on social issues. Although I would say even on the contraception issue, Obama made what I thought was the wrong call in the first place, but then he backed up and tried to compromise. And I support the compromise. The bishops aren't happy with it. My I wanted him to start there, and I was critical of him in the first go-around because I thought there was a legitimate request for accommodation here, that where you could cover people for you could provide for contraception coverage without pushing the religious institutions, particularly the Catholics, quite as hard as his original rule did, that you could give them some leeway in the interests of their religious convictions. So I now wish the bishops, so I had a very odd few weeks in that period as a commentator, where for about 2 weeks I was the conservatives' favorite liberal because I was mad at Obama about this. And then the conservatives got mad at me because I didn't stick with them after Obama compromised. And I was looking for a compromise of the sort that he proposed. I think there are some things that still need to be adjusted about that compromise. And then in terms of Keystone Pipeline, I think that was a political decision. I don't know where he's going to end up with on that. I think that was, that he had nothing to gain by making that decision before the election. And so here I'm saying he probably made a politically convenient decision. And in terms of Bowles Simpson, I do not think that was a centrist proposal. That was a center-right proposal. And I think Chuck Schumer's speech this week really exposed it. And I think if Obama had embraced Bowles Simpson, that would have become the left-wing position. And there's nothing left-wing about Bowles Simpson. The notion that cutting tax rates on rich people, even though you say you're going to fill it in with tax reform, that's not a centrist position. A centrist position would be we raise taxes and we cut some spending. So I'm one of the only sort of media types who write for the kinds of places I do who actually agreed with Obama in abandoning Bowles Simpson. You should know I'm in a very small minority in my category on this. It's not that they weren't well intended. I just think they paid too high a price to get some Republicans to vote for it, and that it wasn't an authentic compromise. It was a compromise tilted right at a moment when the right was at its maximum point of power in Congress. So it was well intended, but I just disagreed with where they ended up. So, and I think Bill Clinton would have ended up there, is my guess.
Thanks. To what extent do you think the format of tonight's debate, the town hall setting, will challenge each of the candidates? I guess in my non-expert opinion at all, it seems like Romney's going to have to show that he's personable and really engaged because he'll be face-to-face with regular old constituents, whereas Obama's going to have to try to challenge Romney and, bring up the 47%, all the things that he didn't really touch on or should have attacked him on in the first debate. So how do you think the format's going to influence how things go tonight?
I've, in my own mind, taken both sides of this question. And so my initial response in thinking about this was similar to yours, which is this is probably good for Romney because what he most needs to show is compassion, understanding. He's not the 47% guy. He's a guy who feels the struggles of ordinary people, and he can talk about how Obama's economy has put so many good, hardworking people in a hole, all that kind of stuff. Whereas Obama needs to make up for, the problems with the first debate and that this forum is not ideal. My second thought has been that while everything I said about Romney is true, he hasn't always shown himself at his best in those circumstances. And Democrats were very disappointed that he didn't burst forth with a Romneyism. I like firing people, even if that was taken out of context, talking about elevators for his cars. My wife has 2 Cadillacs, all that kind of stuff that he's capable of blurting out. Democrats were very disappointed he didn't blurt out any of those things. You wonder if this format might, cause one of those to happen. He's very disciplined, so it may not. On the Obama side, I'm not sure he wants to go sharp on the attack anyway. What he wants to do is join the argument. And so this may actually provide him with a convenient way to call out Romney, but in a way that is not harsh and attacking. Because he doesn't want to be Joe Biden. But if you put, Obama in the first debate is 0 and Joe Biden in his debate as 10, there's a lot of room between 0 and 10. And I think that's actually the space, somewhere in the middle of that is the space Obama wants to occupy. And so if he's clever and has a decent plan for the debate, I think he can use the voters' questions as a way of illustrating, here's where Romney is, here's where I am, and why I think you're better off with me. So right now, between my own two views on this, I lean toward the second, but I agree that the first is a real possibility.
So, as you mentioned, there's a strong tendency, almost I think, the secular aspects of the Republican Party to push for this individualism, versus the religious groups still emphasize the communitarian aspects of American tradition. There's that tension there. What I'm interested about is the Republican Party, with those two forces in it, are willing to push for significant cuts to spending, especially discretionary spending, but there's this resistance on defense spending that with both Romney and even Paul Ryan willing to increase the budget rather than decrease it in order to, reduce the deficit. And understandably, the defense, represents this communitarian ideal of a common defense. But how is, the Republican Party balancing those two issues, and is it something that they're just playing to because it's a strength that they lost over the last 4 years?
I think you should be on that debate stage because I think you pointed to something that I don't think we in journalism, certainly the Obama campaign, has talked about enough, which is essentially the Republicans are saying the government never creates jobs except if they spend the money through the Pentagon. And it's really true. I mean, look at the George Allen ads against Tim Kaine that you see on the air a lot, which is why is he saying we can't cut the defense budget? He's not saying if we cut, he may mention it in passing, if we cut defense spending we'll be less safe. But what he's really saying is we'll lose 200 and whatever 100,000 jobs in Virginia. So they're willing to contradict everything they say on one side of the budget. They're willing to contradict because of their support for defense spending. And I think some of this is just interest group politics, that the defense industry has historically been more sympathetic to the Republicans because the Republicans have spent a heck of a lot more money, Democrats spend a lot of money on defense, but the Republicans have spent even more money on defense. So I think a lot of it is interest group politics. Some of it is philosophical on the part of, my neocon friends like Bill Kristol, who really worry that if you don't spend all this money, then the forms of foreign engagement that they actually believe in would not be possible. But it is a blatant contradiction in theory, which, to their credit, some of the more libertarian and Tea Party Republicans recognize. So there are the Tea Party libertarian Republicans, Rand Paul notably, are as critical of defense spending as they are of other forms of spending. I mean, they really are small government Republicans. And while I have a profound disagreement with them, there is at least consistency in that view. The garden variety, conservative Republican is willing to say both things at the same time. I mean, if I were one of them, I could give you a defense of that view. I'm sure they can, but I think it's just I think it does, really expose a contradiction in their economic view, even if it's not automatically a contradiction. To support defense spending, but not other kinds of spending. But go ahead, you had a follow-up.
I was just going to ask, what about the religious implications for it? Because religion is still a strong aspect of that party. How is that not shaping that conversation?
Well, there is and it may even exist right in this classroom, there is a real difference among religious people over the social implications of the gospel. We'll talk about Christians for what government ought to do about the poor, and that kind of preceding. I don't see. It was your professor many years ago who said, and I got to get this quote right because I quote you all the time and I probably misquote you, but Jim once took a New Testament and just cut out all the parts where Jesus talked about the poor, which leads you to a book full of holes. I've forgotten how you put it. A Bible full of holes. Most conservative Christians know that. They know their scripture. And so what they argue is, yes, we should care about the poor, but government does this inefficiently. It promotes dependency. It doesn't give the kind of love we do. It can't impose sort of demands on people the way we can in our private charity. And so that's their case. So they'll argue, and I think from their point of view in good conscience, that we want to help the poor too. We just don't want to do it through government. And what I've argued with some of my conservative friends who make this argument is, I've always believed that one of the most profound, both Christian and conservative insights is original sin. That we are flawed people. And or Reinhold Niebuhr once said that original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church. And I said, you guys always push this idea that we're flawed people, except when it comes time to help the poor. And then you tell us that if we stop all these government programs, all of us will reach deep in our pockets and give the money to the poor that they need. And I've always thought of the welfare state as our bad conscience, because A, we know we don't do that. And B, we know that even if we did that for the friend across the street, we don't do it for the people across town whom we have never met. That's my argument back to them. But that's the argument that exists among Christians. I believe there are social implications of the gospel that include the matter of how we govern ourselves. My more conservative Christian friends say, no, this is much more about our individual obligations to charity or the obligations to charity of our faith organizations and other voluntary groups. And that, I think, is the argument. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
So a big question that you've probably thought about a lot is why, in the first debate, why didn't our old friend Barack Obama, why didn't he call out Romney? Why didn't he talk more about the balance that your book talks about? You just said it was 0 to 10, and it was 0. Why didn't he call out the candidate, but even at a deeper level, talk about this incredible, important issue of balance and individuality? And why didn't he do that night, do you think?
Well, of course, I believe passionately that if he had done nothing but quote my book for the last 6 months, he'd be at 60% in the polls, and I'd be rich, and then be called upon by my conservative friends to give away what I have to the poor. Seriously, I think there are several things that went into that. One is, because in his rhetoric and in his speeches, he's done a lot of this, as you know. I've been told a number of things, not all of which I am 100% certain of, but I was told, for example, that one of the last things he was told going in is don't attack Romney, that, you are in pretty good shape now. You could cause yourself some trouble doing that. You could create one of those moments that's used against you the way they used it against Biden. And he clearly, at A, overlearned that lesson, and B, I think made no adjustment in the course of the debate when he should have realized that what was happening. So I think that may be a piece of it. Second, somebody who had worked for Obama for a long time told me that one of the biggest dangers for him is when he doesn't fully respect an opponent and he can kind of check out and doesn't take him seriously. And something like that may have happened in that debate. Thirdly, I think the preparation point I made earlier, when he went to see the Hoover Dam, I thought he was preparing for a talking point in the debate about what we achieved together. I didn't think he was just goofing off, but it appeared that he was just goofing off. I thought it was good if he used it as a soundbite. My friend Rachel Maddow has this great promo where she talks about she stands in front of, I think, the Hoover Dam and talks about what we were able to build together, but that wasn't what it was about. And I think he's conflict averse, and I think that is part of him, and that at times that's a really good part of him, and at times that's not a good, that can be a problem for him. Beyond that, I don't know, because I think that, for me, I like happy warriors. I like people who are out there in the fight, try not to be mean about it, but enjoy the fight and can take the fight to somebody else. And look happy in their work. And he just did not look happy in his work. And, that's why I think, what's the song, Don't Worry, Be Happy? He should worry and be happy tonight. So that's my sense. And beyond that, I can't wait for the post-debate accounts because the Saturday Night Live a routine where he's looking down and Lehrer says, Mitt Romney just said you didn't kill bin Laden, he did. Do you have any comment? And he looks up and says, no, and then goes back to, I mean, there was something just peculiar. And I think it was that peculiarity that hit people, both his supporters and the undecideds.
We're going to let EJ go soon.
No, I'm good.
Well, let me interject one real quick. So we've been talking in the course the past couple of weeks on faith in media generally. So in preparation, last week we read President Kennedy's speech.
Faith in media sounds like an oxymoron.
Well, one of the things that we're talking about broadly in the course has been how the mainstream media mostly covers issues related to faith and values. So students read the Kennedy speech to the Houston ministers. We read President Obama's call to renewal speech. But one of the things that we haven't quite settled, I'd like to get your perspective on, is it better? Is it worse? I mean, a lot of people say, oh, the media, and people our age might think, oh, it's just bad. But we don't remember how it was in 1976 when all of a sudden you start hearing about evangelicals, and the newspaper reporter thinks, oh, well, what's an evangelical? You know what I mean? So, I mean, I tend to think it's gotten better, but I also know that a lot of effort has gone into it, and I don't know who pays the bills for this thing in Key West where all the reporters went and, got to learn about religion and hang out in Key West or whatever. But, what's your sense about the state of how religion is treated by the mainstream media?
That's an excellent question, and it's varied over time and by news outlet. Sure. I used to work for the New York Times, and the Times had an active interest in religion going way back, and they had they always had sort of some very sharp, still have some very sharp religion reporters. Gus Niebuhr, Ken Briggs, way back when, was ordained Methodist minister. Peter Steinfels. They've had some of the best people in the business, and then when I covered the Vatican. There was enormous interest. I had a lot of room. They wanted stories. It happened to be a really interesting moment to cover the Vatican. It was sort of the peak of John Paul's papacy. You had two great heresies going on, as I used to say, the North American heresy, which was about sex, and the South American heresy, which was about Marxism. But, you had, Ratzinger condemning various theologians. Incidentally, you could tell where he condemned a left-of-center theologian called Leonardo Boff, and you could tell I had an American source in Ratzinger's office because the fourth paragraph of the New York Times story that I wrote was a quotation from somebody who worked for Cardinal Ratzinger, and the quotation was, Boff makes Rome sound like a four-letter word, which only works if you're speaking English. And so it was a period of great ferment and interest. The Pope was traveling all over the world. But in any event, so the Times always had that interest. The Post has had some great some great religious reporters. Didn't have quite as much emphasis as the Times did for a while, then increased the emphasis over the years. So Gus Niebuhr, who went to the Times has hired away religion reporters from the Post, which is, sort of says something about the quality of the Post folks. In general, I think religion, and NPR, began a serious religion beat. And I think back in the day before the total collapse of the financing of the news industry, there was a kind of correction going on in the broader media to say, my God, we take so many subjects seriously, and yet this subject, religion, which is so important in the lives of so many people, we don't cover as seriously. And some of it, I think, also was a fear that whenever you write about religion, boy, do you open yourself for attack. Because people, if you write something critical, even if it's only about the worldly failures, whether it's embezzlement of money or a sex scandal, it is taken in a very personal way by people who see you going after something that the source of their meaning in a deep sense. And so it took time for the media to get over that. The media are also the quintessential Enlightenment profession. I always say that my patron saint is St. Thomas the Apostle. Okay, Jesus, let me see the wounds, I mean, a reporter doesn't say, yeah, this resurrection story is great, but show me. And so Jesus actually, showed St. Thomas. So in some ways I thought he was the first Christian journalist, But there is something about journalism, I found a good example of how do you do this in a secular medium. I'll never forget, I was covering what in principle was one of the easiest stories you could write. This was back when I was on the Times. And I'm writing about the Pope's Easter Mass. And so it's mostly about pomp and about his sermon, and it wasn't a complicated story. But I got to the, either in the lead, it was in the lead, I guess, Easter, the day that Christians, well, then I thought, all right, the day that Christians claim, the day celebrating the Christian claim that Jesus rose from the dead, that makes it sound like a lie, alleged Jesus rose from the dead, that makes it sound like a crime. What word do you use in a secular newspaper to describe Easter? I think I ended up using revere as the day that Jesus, celebrating some, I found some formulation, but it just goes to show, or also while I was there, the Pope gave some interesting sermons on angels. There was the Vatican issued orders for dioceses to name exorcists, so I ended up writing about devils. It's fun to write about devils for a secular newspaper and whether the devil exists or not. But these are all challenging subjects for secular media. The other thing is, and Jim has fought this all his life, is that because religion was initially placed on the public agenda by Jimmy Carter. After the Kennedy election, it sort of went away. People decided, well, we don't want to go through that anti-Catholicism again. Let's just sort of leave it alone. And then Jimmy Carter forced it in everybody's place. And journalists describing born-again Christians sounded like anthropologists in some faraway place describing these strange born-again Christians. But they got over that. But then came the rise of the religious right. And then I think this has been a really big problem. Back in the day, Ken Briggs and I, who was then the religion reporter at the Times, was a very close friend, and we talked about this stuff a lot. And there was a sense that religion lived exclusively on the right, and I think that was a kind of prejudice within established journalism that served the interests of both the religious right and more secular people on the left, who viewed religion as being fundamentally conservative anyway. Now, occasionally there were stories that challenged that view when the Catholic bishops in the mid-'80s came out with very strong progressive statements on both war and peace and poverty. That you couldn't just say, oh, these guys only care about abortion. So there were moments of challenging that, but I think that has been a persistent problem. And that we don't cover serious theologians the way we used to. I mean, both Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr were on the cover of Time magazine. Can you imagine Hauerwas or any number of really great theologians who are out there? And I'm not talking about sort of people who write in just a popular fashion about religion, or people, as the academics might say of me in another part of my life, mere journalists. I mean, but the media used to pay serious attention to serious theologians. You don't see that.
Well, yeah, we couldn't.
Niebuhr couldn't get on the cover of Time now.
He couldn't get on A20. The paper. We couldn't think of, the beginning of the course, what theologian you might even consider a public intellectual today.
Yeah, it's. So, I mean, whereas they were very much part of the discourse. So progress and regress at the same time, and then. That I think that in certain ways we're better off than we used to be, but in some deep and fundamental ways we're worse off than we were quite some time ago. And then the cutbacks in the media have been problematic because the growth in the serious coverage of religion happened before the collapse of the financial model of the media, and religion is one place that's taken it on the chin. It would be interesting actually to call the Association of Religious News Writers to see what's happened to their own membership because I think it's suffered. So anyway, that's a long answer to what is obviously a question that's engaged me for a long time.
Well, that prompted Ken Briggs, you mentioned Ken, New York Times. Remember one time he came down and he just showed up at our office at Sojourners on a Friday, and Wes and I talked to him. And he asked about the movement against nuclear weapons. Now, the truth is, at that time, the faith community was kind of the animating core of the anti-nuclear movement, the Freeze campaign and all that stuff. Ken just sat there for an hour and a half and listened. He just asked questions, didn't take a note, just talked. We thought it was just a conversation. Sunday, front page New York Times, huge story by Ken Briggs, how the faith community was indeed the animating core of this movement to reverse the arms race. And it was normally you didn't get front page New York Times, and it wasn't about abortion or gay marriage. It was about the nuclear arms race and how the gospel of peacemaking led these Christians to be at the center of this. But Ken was unusual in that regard. And I think what EJ just said about, there was almost, I remember reporters who liked to put Jerry Falwell on the air, on the front page, because he was their stereotype of what religion was. All religion is fundamentalist religion, and a lot of people on the left think that all religion is fundamentalism. So Falwell, I think, used that. The press made Falwell a household word. Yeah. My father was an evangelical. He called Jerry Falwell, he says he's not an evangelical, he's a fundamentalist. And Falwell became known because of the liberal press who thought he was crazy and who thought that Falwell would just hang himself, nobody would like him, and he created this tremendous base for himself. Now, tie that to the thing we did this morning at the press club. The growing affiliation religiously now is what? The highest growing affiliation? Nuns. None of the not nuns. No, I said this morning at the press club. I said the gross number is nuns, not nuns in the bus, but none of the above. And if you look at the data, the reason that's happening is because of young people's reaction to what the religious right has created as the image of what it means to be religious. So this conversation is right at the heart of changing demographics in the country. And that's why this morning the young evangelicals conversation, if more people heard those young evangelicals talk about their faith, including abortion, but a consistent ethic of life, there'd be a different reaction from the nuns, you know. So this coverage of religion is critical, and part of it, Dallas Morning News, EJ knows, once had a staff, the religion department, I think they must have had almost 10 reporters at one point. It was a huge, and now there's nothing there. So all the cuts.
It's hard to believe it was 10.
At one point, I spoke to them once. It was 10 of them that they were all somehow related to this new section. They had a whole section, and it was huge. And nobody else was anywhere near that high, but there's nothing there now. You know, so all the cuts, the religion writers have often been cut first. And if now, I mean, a lot of your papers said this, but I can't tell you the number of times that we get these interviews and calls, and you're doing Religion 101 yet again for a religion reporter who just got shifted to that beat from, county news. And they're going to be there for a year until they go on to someplace else, and they just don't know the first thing. So we have this joke around Sojourners. We have this educational sort of seminar for religion reporters all the time. So, but you have wonderful people like Ken Briggs, Marge Heyer here in town, Gus Niebuhr. So how faith gets covered in the press is really a big issue for us to look at.
Can I just, two things. One is to go back to our friend Ken, and just to make clear, I don't think Jim is saying, and I'm certainly not saying, that Falwell shouldn't have gotten quite a lot of coverage. And Ken did cover him quite a lot, but he didn't make him the only voice of religious people in America, and that he didn't actually, in a curious way, I always thought in some ways Ken was fairer to the religious right than others because he didn't just treat them as this wacky bunch of really dangerous, powerful folks. He took them as who they were. He talked about the things that were extreme and was straight up about it, but at the same time he didn't confine religion to that. But there is the great old joke
told among reporters about what would happen if a TV reporter were covering Moses coming down from the mountain after receiving the Ten Commandments. And the story is always told, you know, that the reporter is all excited and said Moses just announced the Ten Commandments, and the producer says to the reporter, look, we've only got a minute 20. Can you just report on the 3 most important commandments? And I always thought, actually, that that joke could serve a preacher very well, because I wonder if I actually went through the exercise once. What would you say are the 3 most important commandments if you could only had a minute 20 on TV to report? And you know, it would be a fascinating poll, because I bet you could actually tell a lot about someone's belief system depending on which 3 of the 10 they picked out. But that is also, you know, that is another journalistic problem that's just classic, not limited to this time. But again, at a time of shrinking news holes, you have had outlets kind of replacing that. I mean, you do have BeliefNet. You've had other people trying to do, HuffPost has a big religion section. So you see other people. So it's not a wasteland by any means. And there are still good reporters out there. But I think that, you know, religion has suffered probably disproportionately. Religion coverage has suffered disproportionately in the cutbacks you've seen in recent years.
So tonight, when you watched the debate, some of your reflections talked about how religion was covered briefly in the Biden-Biden debate. Look for how religion is covered explicitly, you know, but also, if at all, but also look for the issues in the debate that really are at a deeper level religious, moral issues, but aren't sort of talked about as such. EJ is someone who writes columns all the time in which the values questions are always there underneath the sort of news cycle. The values choices are there, and that's why I love the way he writes. So let's thank EJ for coming to us on a very busy day for him.